Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Strengthening Supply Chain Resilience in Europe. Welcome as well to the Swiss Re Institute Spotlights. This is our series of thought-provoking webinars and events produced with Swiss Re Corporate Solutions. Today's webinar is the fifth one in our series, and today we're going to put the spotlight on the impact of natural catastrophes and extreme weather events and how you can make your supply chains more resilient. My name is Mark Covarrubias. I'm the head of Strategic Account Management in EMEA. Joining me today at the Swiss Re Institute are three very distinguished experts and industry thought leaders. I'd like to quickly run through our agenda today for you before I introduce our experts. So we will start today with Lucia Bevere, Senior Catastrophe Data Analyst at the Swiss Re Institute. Lucia will launch the webinar by presenting a natural catastrophes view of 2018 with the economic losses worldwide and in Europe and what we may be able to expect in the coming years. Following Lucia is Sharina Kamal from DHL's Resilience 360 unit. Sharina will present two case studies about how severe weather events impacted supply chains and how businesses can better prepare for the next events. Finally, Tom Keist from Swiss Re Corporate Solutions will present how we from the insurance sector, maybe better said we from Swiss Re Corporate Solutions, can help make your supply chains more resilient. A quick logistic topic. Our experts will each speak for about 7 minutes, and then we will invite them back at the end for about a 15 to 20 minute panel discussion to address some of your questions. Unfortunately, due to the technical setup of the webinar, whatever you are saying out there, we can't hear you, but rest assured that we're listening. On the left side of your screen, you will see a question field. Just send in your questions at any time, and instead of the traditional vocal Q&A session at the end after each presentation, I'm going to save the questions for the panel discussion at the end. However, to keep it a little bit spontaneous, if there is a burning question that is relevant during the speaker, we may change the format a little bit and take the question live during that particular speaker, but conceptually we'll have the panel discussion at the end. So, now, let's hear from Lucia for a view on natural catastrophes and economic losses. Lucia, I'm happy to hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. This will be a recap of the lessons from the global catastrophic activity of 2018 through the claims that it brought to the insurers and which we think is useful to share with the corporate world. In 2018, global disasters that met sigma thresholds caused overall insured losses of $85 billion in US dollars. This is the fourth highest level ever recorded, and this is in the absence of a truly major catastrophe event. Together, 2017 and 2018 will go down as the costliest two-year period ever. The difference with the economic losses points to underinsurance, mainly in the residential sector, but there are also pockets of underinsurance even in the industrial and commercial ones. Here we are talking about direct losses. Some sectors suffered severe indirect losses, namely the non-physical damage, business interruption from some of the events of the year, but we will see. So what happened in 2018? Similarly to 2017, catastrophic inland flooding due to extreme rainfall associated with tropical cyclones, it was Harvey in 2017, Florence last year, confirmed once again a trend which is consistent with climate projections. The Earth continues to warm up, loading the atmosphere with more water vapor, leading to more extreme rainfall events during hurricanes and other weather events. Other meteorological extremes, including record high temperatures, heat waves, have affected many locations in the Northern Hemisphere, including Europe, triggering yet devastating forest fires, as it was the year before. Now, most of the losses of 2018 originated from secondary perils. Just to clarify, primary perils are mainly hurricanes and earthquakes. Secondary perils are mainly floods, wildfires, drought, local storms, thunderstorms. In fact, More than half of the losses of the last 2 years were due to these secondary perils, and generally, losses from this type of perils are increasing. What difference does it make? Why do we highlight this? Because for most of the secondary perils that so much contributed to the losses of last year, the link with climate change is direct, and there is medium to high level of confidence that this type of weather extremes will become more severe and frequent within a changing climate. Does that mean that the losses of the last years are already the result of climate change? Well, it's not really so simple. That is because societal changes are happening and rising population and urbanization increase the exposure. Let's take wildfires, for example. One of the costliest wildfires have occurred the majority of the largest and costliest wildfires have occurred in recent years. In fact, one of the costliest events of the year was a wildfire, which is a secondary peril, campfire in California. Insured losses from this type of perils are increasing dramatically. Wildfires are an ever-present hazard. They are an essential part of the renewal process of the forest ecosystem in the world. Every single day in the world, there are forests burning. There are 2 reasons why they are becoming more dangerous. With the continuous expansion of exposure and population in the wildland-urban interface where houses and forests meet, there is a greater risk of losses of this magnitude to become more frequent, even without warmer and drier weather. Most of the new houses, for example, built in the US since 1919 have been built along this interface. In fact, human activity in the wild and urban interface area brings with it not only greater exposure of life and property to wildfires, but also an additional sources of ignition, sparks from machinery, trains, power lines, escaping campfires, as well as arson. They are all wildfire hazards introduced by property development. The risk landscape is changing significantly for companies that, for example, produce and distribute power, for example. This is exacerbated This is exacerbated by a changing environment. Fire seasons are growing longer. Earlier snow melt leaves the forest drier for longer. Then in the summer, longer dry spells generate more dried out vegetation on the ground, which easily ignites and fuels fires. Beetle infestations compounding the problem. What else happened in 2018? Well, another event also connected to heat. Summer of 2018 in Europe was remarkable from a hydroclimate perspective. It may have not reached the peak temperatures of the summer of 2003, but the weather was drier for much longer, leading to a drought of severe intensity, which affected agriculture, but not only. In fact, the impact went well beyond agriculture. Water levels of most rivers in Europe were at record low levels. The Rhine hit its historical lowest water levels ever at several locations, disrupting shipping and squeezing European supplies of important industrial commodities. Not only in road traffic, the heat damaged the roads and resulted in road closures and speed reductions. Train traffic was disturbed by deformed rails and embankment fires. In air traffic, planes were cancelled or delayed. Some companies released a quantification of the impact of the drought. These losses could not be claimed from insurers because they mostly did not materialize in physical damage. Yet the business interruption, even in the absence of physical damage, at times was severe. To conclude, why is it important to increase awareness of this type of perils, the secondary perils? With a few exceptions, insurers have tended to focus on primary peak loss-generating perils, such as hurricanes in the North Atlantic. The discipline of secondary peril risk modeling has not been afforded the same priority. But given their unique features, such as being highly localized, modeling secondary perils risks can be difficult, more so than for peak perils where the industry has tended to focus so far. But with the urbanization and associated growth in asset concentration in exposed areas, and also long-term climate change projections, we expect the trend of growing losses from secondary perils to continue. Thank you very much, and now I pass to Mark.
Thank you, Lucia. I think it's always extremely eye-opening to have a summary like that, because we have these events that are happening by the weeks and by the months, and you get lost in how many occur. So to have a review looking back over the past 2 years is always very eye-opening, sometimes not always in a comfortable way. I think we should keep that secondary peril topic in mind, because I think that is a topic that certainly is going to be growing, and you've just shown us that, because we've all been focusing on the primary perils first of all. Thank you for that, Lucia. I'd like to remind the audience that if you do have a question for Lucia, or in fact at any time during the webinar, please do send it in by using the comment box or the Q&A box on your screens. We'll take that up at the panel discussion towards the end. Next up is Sharina from DHL, and Sharina is going to give us a view on what this increase in the number of severity and natural hazards and extreme weather events actually mean for supply chains in Europe. Sharina, I'd like to hand it over to you, please.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Mark, and good morning, everyone. Building supply chain resilience is naturally easier said than done. Resilience 360's journey to building and strengthening supply chain resilience really began in the year 2011, when the Fukushima disaster in Japan occurred, followed by severe floods in Thailand in the same year, causing extensive damages to tech and auto supply chains. These two critical events made us take a step back and start to think about what supply chain resilience really means, how we could go about addressing it, and more importantly, help our customers build such resilience within their networks. The Resilience 360 team at DHL started out by dissecting questions one must ask and, of course, strive to answer when addressing resilience. As organizations, we must ask ourselves, do we know where we operate? Do we know where all our shipments are at any given time? Do we have a pulse on what's going on in the world? Are the supply chain partners that I depend on to keep my network moving in good shape? Do they have the required business continuity measures in place? These questions led us to using data-driven approaches in assessing resiliency and eventually determining which areas need more attention than others. One example of a data-driven approach that we've found to be extremely valuable is by looking at near real-time information on events that are happening, thereby enabling organizations to take decisions on the fly on what can and cannot be done. In case of Hurricane Harvey in 2017, Resilience 360 combined tracking technology that helped monitor the development of the storm system with on-the-ground intelligence provided by DHL operational staff to provide key insights into which access roads were open, whether freight could be shipped to intermodal stations, and which parts of the Houston ship channel was restricted, making it easier to make informed decisions during the crisis. Now let's take a more recent case from last year. Last year shows that data-driven approaches can also be more strategic in nature. Last summer, record low water levels on the Rhine caused significant logistical and procurement challenges for manufacturing supply chains. Industries relying on inbound deliveries using barge transportation, most notably chemical and steel plants along the Rhine, were hard hit and forced to shut down production due to raw material shortages. This, in turn, led to shortages in intermediate products in industries as diverse as auto, electronics, and pharmaceutical. The over-reliance on one mode of transportation, resulting in costs associated with production halt, switching transportation modes, and acquiring ad hoc capacity, demonstrated that organizations must use mapping and visibility capabilities to assess where their bottlenecks are and develop contingency plans in case risks materialize. Now, what can businesses do to prepare, especially in light of an ever-evolving risk landscape? In the short term, organizations can monitor real-time information on weather and natural disasters to stay informed of impending events, such as hurricanes or weather issues or any sort of flooding. Organizations can also identify key transportation routes and key suppliers that may be affected by an upcoming forecasted event and prepare in advance by stocking up essential materials and even moving cargo in advance if required. In the long term, one must test business continuity plans ahead and use visibility tools to understand which locations or transportation routes are exposed to certain risks. When risks are identified, it's also good to consider diversifying manufacturing locations or transportation modes to avoid the pitfalls of over-reliance on one solution, as we've seen with the Rhine situation last year. As the famous physicist Niels Bohr once said, prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. We can't, of course, predict the future, but we can change how we prepare for it. And recognizing that is where the journey to building supply chain resilience really begins. Thank you. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Sharon. It's a fascinating insight, and I'm struck by the fact that a lot of the supply chain resilience focus is less than 10 years old. In many ways, it's certainly in its infancy, and plenty of good things to come. And it's impressive the progress that we have made, that DHL has made, just in the short time that you've put this under focus. What I would like to remind you again is, please do remember to hand in your questions on the left side of the screen so that we can take those in the Q&A at the end. I would now like to have Tom Keiss join and show us what this all means from a risk business perspective and how we can help to make your supply chains more resilient. So I'd like to hand it over to Tom Keiss from Corporate Solutions, Innovative Risk Solutions.
Thanks, Mark, and good morning to all. So we have now so far heard what is actually happening with our climate and the impacts on first and secondary perils, what we have seen in the past and what we believe is going on also in future. We have heard how we can actually make supply chain more resilient using technology and enhance management of these kind of challenges. What I would like to come in with now is how can we address the financial impacts that corporates may suffer from these kind of developments. And the good news is that in terms of insurance protections, options are growing as we speak. Since a couple of years, we have seen tremendous developments also on the protection side. And I think that is really good news. So we have an increased availability of data now from sensors and cameras, and we can use that data to simplify how we respond with insurance to these challenges and actually provide insurance coverage in a new way. We call it parametric insurance. And just very briefly on what it is, extremely briefly here, you can see in the little drawing that we have an event happening and we have sensors measuring the event and also its size. And if the size exceeds a certain threshold, the insurance pays a predefined amount. So not something we are evaluating after the event, but we already know when the event is happening. This is extremely efficient and ensures a payout very quickly for corporates who need to take measures and money in their hands to counter the challenges of such supply chain interruptions. I want to give you an example of, basically addressing what we heard before in both contributions about the low river water levels in Europe 2018 and how we can respond to it. Just as an example to make it very crisp and clear how this would work. So with this parametric insurance, we call it flow. We would basically address increased transportation costs and business interruptions when river water levels are low, as they were in Europe last year. So what is happening, this flow solution provides fixed daily payouts to insureds if the water level is below a certain level. It's quite simple, actually. So you can see a little table at the bottom. It says, it's basically an example, right? Just illustrative. The trigger would be if the water level at, for example, the gauge Kaub is below 60 centimeters, which is a critical height. The payout would be, for example, 25,000 per day. It could also be more, it could also be a bit less. And this is basically how this parametric insurance works. There's not much more to it. Of course, the devil's in the detail, but for that, please just start to talk to us. Let's go on. So, if you look at today's typical application areas for parametric insurance, it is actually always natural perils. And the reason for that is that as you can imagine, insurance needs historical data to be able to apply probabilities to an event happening. Now, we have historic data for all these natural perils, way back, hundreds of years. So for typhoons or hurricanes, basically windstorms, we have it, we can measure wind speed, and we can measure storm categories, and we actually have historical data as well. For earthquake, it's about its magnitude and shaking intensity, flood is precipitation and river levels, and then with respect to weather in general, you can have bad weather, which we can measure, and we can have also wrong weather, which we can measure. You know, sometimes there's more wind needed, and sometimes less. And for some crop, you know, too much precipitation is good, and too little is bad, or the other way around. So these are typical areas, and I think looking forward with increased availability of data and also historical data and measure points, think about the Internet of Things and so forth, you can imagine that parametric insurance will take more areas than just this one. But today we do have clear solutions and very good solutions for natural perils and the respective impacts on your financial situation as a corporate. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. It's fascinating things to see real innovation in insurance, so I think it's always nice to have a preview from you about what some thought leaders are doing to try and solve some of the perils, to try and solve some of the losses that Lucia and Shervina have alluded to. So it's great to have some concrete examples. We have several questions. What I would like to do is maybe go back first to you, Lucia. We have a question about why is risk modeling for secondary perils not as developed as it is for primary perils, for example, hurricanes, etc.
Yes, thank you. Because the industry models first developed precisely after Hurricane Andrew, which was a hurricane, so a peak loss generating, and for all the risk modeling developed. First of all, for this type of perils, primary perils, in areas with high insurance penetrations. The modeling for the other types of perils, if we exclude flood in the US, of course, left behind for three reasons. First of all, because the areas vulnerable to primary perils are generally well defined, whereas for the secondary perils, this is not the case. They are extremely localized. And they do not impact the areas in a homogeneous way. And the secondary perils are virtually present almost everywhere. And because of this, an enormous amount of data and computational power is required to model the probability of a peril affecting the same area more than once. Also, some of the secondary perils, for example, wildfires, can be influenced also by man-made factors. Ignition, as we said, can be accidental, even deliberate. And this is extremely difficult to model. However, as we said, given the rising losses from such secondary perils, it is paramount that we improve our understanding of these high-frequency secondary perils.
Thank you, Lucia. Let's take the next. So, Sharanya, a few questions for you. I'm going to try my best to try and summarize a little bit of the flavor about what DHL is doing. Are there, summarizing, it seems to be a very fast-moving, data-intense, data-driven view that you're taking. Can you give us a view or give us a preview of what additional research, what additional thinking you have, and which direction R360 may be evolving to in the near future about what you're modeling right now?
Great, that's a great question. So one of the areas that we're looking to evolve into is understanding ETA predictions using past data. So for example, if there has been a hurricane and if there have been previous examples of events taking place that have impacted shipments and cargo movement, what can historical data tell us about potential new ETA as a result of that disruption? And how can customers then use that information to rearrange their supply chain network, product flows, cargo flows, and be able to keep up with that based on that information. So this is a very exciting new frontier for us because as DHL being the biggest logistics company in the world, we do have a lot of shipment information that enables us to drive some of these analysis, and combining that with risk data allows us to bring in two very different sets of information that customers can use to determine what actions they can take, basically, in case of a disruption. So that's one thing. Another area that we're looking extensively into is using machine learning to capture more information, more relevant supply chain related risk information in real time to be able to alert users and customers about what is happening and making sure that they get that information as quickly as possible to take action. So a lot of technology-driven innovation that we're striving for, and trying to combine lots of different sources of data to be able to provide key insights that organizations can use.
Thank you, Sharanya. Question for you, Tom. You've outlined a few examples of solutions that Swiss Re Corporate Solutions has done. Is there a common thread in the parametric solutions that discussions that you have had? Is there something that's common when you're looking across the perils? Is there an industry in common? Is there are the exposures in common? So is there a red thread in the discussions that you have when you kick off the discussions with clients looking to do a parametric deal?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it actually looks at the development a bit. So a couple of years back, it was always about earthquake and hurricanes, and only earthquake and hurricane. But these days, actually, discussions go into all directions. That's the interesting thing. So again, with availability of data widening into all sorts of areas, you can see a really widespread discussion starting. So to give you examples, far away from natural perils, actually is, it's basically man-made perils, like some things like terrorism. You have, and political violence. We have discussions where we want to use parametric insurance using data from, like passenger data on airports, or occupancy data of hotels to structure a parametric insurance coverage. So, whereas in the past it was mostly industries impacted by, earthquake and hurricanes, we today start to talk about a very, very diverse application area for parametric insurance.
Tom, I'm going to ask a follow-up on that one. Would it be fair to say that the payout structure of a parametric solution is different than a traditional BI or CBI? Traditional BI, CBI payments can in fact happen quarters or sometimes years after the event. Would parametric function differently?
Indeed, that's the main point about parametric insurance, is that once you have the event that it was defined triggered, parametric insurance pays out very quickly, basically within, let's say, 30 days. the client does have cash in hand from this insurance, and it's basically no questions asked. You have no lawyers involved, no loss adjusters involved, and that's the beauty of this efficient way of addressing insurance protection.
Thanks, Tom. Lucia, let's turn back to you. Another question, a simple one, but the simple ones can sometimes be the most challenging, perhaps. Do you see an increase in flood losses also?
Yes, definitely. We see a marked increase in the flood losses in terms of events, in terms of occurrences, also on the losses, in terms of the losses generated by such occurrences, particularly the pluvial floods, much less the river floods due to snow melts. We see a strong increase in pluvial floods, in precipitation-induced flooding, particularly in urban areas. And also we see an increase of flood due also to thunderstorm activities, even in outside of floodplain areas. Not necessarily close to a water body, but even just in town, in cities, far away from waterways. And that is due to the runoff, to the water that doesn't get absorbed into the ground.
Interesting, Lucia. Thank you. Additionally, Tom, just thinking about how the triggers are set, are there components that we need to have as far as the reporting? So how do you, when we're talking about a trigger, let's take flood. Who is it that's actually determining the level of the water? Or who is it that we're using to measure the rainfall? Is that something that the client provides? Is that something that we provide? So what is who's the ultimate judge on whatever the trigger may be, as far as wind speed, as far as rainfall, flood levels, etc.?
With respect to the low water level protection that we have addressed in this webinar, it's actually data that is provided by the gauges in the rivers. There are hundreds of them. Only, if you look, for example, in Germany, there's really hundreds of them. And the data is provided automatically and can also be monitored automatically. But then there is also an authority who actually goes back and verifies the data. So they check it and they verify it. This is also the point. We usually need to have an objective, third-party, unrelated verification of data. Now, in the case of these river gauges, this is relatively easy. If we take data that is actually provided from the corporate client itself to trigger a parametric insurance, for example, let's assume passenger numbers on airports or in trains or on airplanes. We need definitely a way to objectively verify and third-party check the data before we can use it for obvious reasons. So the data needs to be objective. But we usually find ways to do that.
Thank you, Tom. We have a question that I think we'll put out to the panel and whoever is most comfortable with that. It says, heavy rain can be extremely local. Are we using satellites?
Yes, of course, particularly in parametric solutions, satellite data are used increasingly and the availability of good granular data, even from satellite imagery, is increasing, and therefore it's possible to carve solutions, parametric solutions, based on the usage of satellite imagery.
Thank you, Lucia. Shireen, I think a question for you. What is the evolution of risks that DHL is seeing?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think just to mirror what Tom said earlier, we started out with hurricanes and floods and earthquakes, but supply chain risks have really evolved quite a bit over the last years. And even before the year before last, trade restrictions or trade regulations was not something that we had thought a great deal about, but that's one of the biggest supply chain risks that we're affected by today. Not to mention an abundance of cyber risks and ransomware attacks that we've been seeing, especially on supply chain entities like ports and carriers and operators. So there's been a great evolution in terms of the risks that companies can face. It's not to say that the earlier risks or the traditional risks are not there anymore. All of that has been sort of expounded as we have moved forward.
Very interesting. Thank you, Sharina. Another question for you, and maybe I'll just remind the audience we do have the Q&A box on the left side of your screen for the final round of questions for the panel. Sharina, next question. I don't know how far you have developed with DHL, but what about machine learning and AI? Is this also a component that DHL is also considering in what you're doing with R360? So the question is around AI and machine learning.
Absolutely. We actually have our own team of data scientists that are looking at specifically topics around machine learning and artificial intelligence. Just one example that I had used earlier was looking at a vast amount of information and being able to, sweep out the noise that obviously exists in that amount of data and being able to identify key things that are important for us. And over time, the goal is to be as predictive as possible. I know it's a loaded word. A lot of people use it, but the goal is to be able to find patterns and create predictions around what can actually be the impact when certain events take place. So there's a big push within Resilience 360 to look at this and be able to become more predictive in the way that we look at risks and as well as risk mitigation measures that can come out of them.
Thank you, Sharina. Let's take one more question. I think we've had the webinar scheduled for 45 minutes. I think we can take maybe one more question, unless one more would pop in while we're taking this one. I think, Lucia, this one's coming from your area, you have mentioned wildfires, but the losses examples were primarily from North America. What about wildfires in Europe?
The risk is definitely growing in Europe also, and we already saw the results of that. We saw massive wildfires in 2017 in Portugal. We also saw wildfires last year in Greece, costly for the society and for the insurance sector as well. In fact, for Portugal, for example, the wildfires are the biggest loss insured ever in the country. We see several occurrences also in Sweden. So the risk is increasing everywhere because the exposure, again, in the wildland-urban interface is, even in Europe, is increasing, particularly touristic resorts.
Thank you, Lucia. I suppose that is all the time that we have for today. There are a few questions that may be somewhat answered or maybe a little bit unanswered, but you can reach out in those cases to your Swiss Re client manager or your key contact. Also, if you have more specific market or solution related questions, please don't hesitate to, in fact, contact Tom or even myself. I'd also like to thank you, Lucia. Thank you very much, Sharina. Thank you as well, and Tom as well, for your contributions today. I'm sure all of you out there will join me in wishing them success with their current endeavors. We would like to stay in touch with you following today's webinar, so you can expect a follow-up email from us with a recorded version of the webinar. You can also share it and pass it on further with other colleagues and clients as well. We'd also will include a link to the Swiss Re Institute web pages where you can find more information on our forthcoming events and our publications, including our next Spotlight webinar with Swiss Re Corporate Solutions. On that note, we'll finish up, and on behalf of Swiss Re Institute and Corporate Solutions and DHL's webinar team today, I'd like to thank you for joining us and wish you a very nice day. Thank you very much.